E-hailing drivers are taking a rise over the transport market. Are they contractors or are they workers? Well, we'll find out on today's show. Workers' World starts now.
From England to Poland, every step across the ocean, the ruling classes, them is in a mess. Oh yes, the capitalist system are regress, but the Soviet system now progress.
Welcome to the weekly Workers' World Labour Show. I'm your host, Tashirik Truebody. The ride-sharing service Uber has experienced the most rapid rise in the recent years, taking over traditional transport markets across the world, and is very profitable, with the CEO raking in approximately $45 million every year. In Africa, digital e-hailing platforms like Uber and others like Taxify and Bolt, and lately DiDi in Johannesburg, as well as FastaFasta in Dar es Salaam, have entered the passenger transport markets of major cities, taking over big market share. But drivers, after the initial attraction, face difficulty and challenging working conditions and problems. Before we get into our discussion today, let's go now to our insert prepared for us by the Workers' World editorial team.
It's hard to maintain this because to start the day, you must have money.
As I open and look into the side window to see who's knocking, this guy is taking my phone, he's running.
The ride-sharing service Uber has experienced the most rapid rise in recent years, taking over traditional transport markets across the world, and is very profitable, with the CEO, Dara Khosrowshahi, raking in millions of dollars every year. In Africa, digital e-hailing platforms like Uber and others like Taxify or Bolt, and lately DiDi in Johannesburg and FastaFasta in Dar es Salaam, have entered the passenger transport markets of major cities, taking over big market share. Drivers face difficult and challenging working conditions and problems. These include declining income, increasing working hours, and rising financial difficulties such as vehicle debt and personal expenses.
You know, this business has got a lot of expenses, running expenses, a lot.
It's hard to maintain this because to start the day, you must have money. Money, I mean, you must have money for petrol, you must have money for data, the car must be clean. To wash the car at the car wash, it's money.
Uber's operating model has ensured that the company is not responsible for these problems because drivers are not regarded as employees but so-called independent contractors. In this way, and unlike other companies, Uber has shifted the financial burden of their business onto the workers.
We are being fooled to thinking that we are partners. But if you look at the operation, you look at the setup, there is no partnership at all. So driver partners are just driver partners by name, but practically they're not.
Now, fuel is ever increasing. The rate at which industry offers or sells the services, the pricing has remained the same for several years because Uber, Bolt, and DiDi find it more important to be competitive amongst each other instead of ensuring that their so-called partners can go home at the end of the day with a decent income.
Workers are beginning to organize to improve their conditions in different ways. They organize through messaging apps and social media. They have the option to organize cooperatives and worker centers. Trade unions have an important role to play in organizing them and increasing their power against the multinational corporations. In this way, through union representation, platform workers can ensure that their dismal working conditions are converted into decent work.
I was a guinea pig for 4 years in the e-hauling service, and I didn't like it. And until they actually put up more regulations or trying to make it more better, I'm not going back and being a contractor or driver.
Unions should open up to workers in the platform economy to be prepared for the future of work and to expand their membership base.
All right, so we heard there are some very real challenges, notwithstanding the lack of regulation in the sector, but we also saw the scenario where workers truly felt that they could have had their own businesses, their own manner in which they're able to generate funds for themselves. But with increasing scenarios where profits are taken to these companies like Uber, Bolt, and others, what sort of protections are there for their own very jobs? And to what extent are they able to really make a living? We'll get into this and more once we return from the break. Welcome back to the weekly Workers' World Labour Show. Thank you so very much for joining us. All right, let's get into our conversation. Uber, DiDi, Bolt, these e-hailing services that are around, how do they actually work and what do we understand from them? Batuka Mbilengwa is on the line with me, the national spokesperson for the e-hailing sector. Kobile Chezi is an independent researcher joining us as well, and particularly looking at the political economy in Dar es Salaam, Nairobi, and Johannesburg. Thank you so very much for having joined us here today. I'd like to start with you, Kobile, just to understand the industry that we sit with. What is e-hailing? How does one understand the industry firstly?
Okay, thank you very much for having me here. So Uber was the first ride-sharing service to launch on the African continent, right? The South African cities of Johannesburg, Cape Town, and Durban were the first cities to receive the service in 2012, with the rapid expansion to 7 more countries in the continent by 2019. While additional competitors such as Bolt and FastaFasta have since launched services, Uber is the largest ride-sharing service on the African continent. In the past 10 years, since launching in Africa, Uber has accumulated over 60,000 drivers across the continent. And this is done because, Uber has successfully evaded regulations in South Africa and has also developed a business model that suits the African market. Now, you asked what exactly is e-hailing. So what basically happens is that you have a technology platform and Uber, Bolt, etc. offer the software where they connect drivers and customers on the platform. Now, they claim to not be a transport service company, but rather a platform or software company. And basically that is what Uber is about. So what they basically do, like I said, is they use technology to connect networks of individuals within a crowd-based marketplace where peers exchange services, right? So drivers in this case are service providers and they share assets, resources, skills, etc. And then as the customers go onto the platform and we order a ride. And this is done because Uber also assumes different assumptions. One assumption is that these drivers actually own their cars, and we know that's not factual, at least in the SA context.
Okay, I want to stay with you very quickly. How does it work? Of course, for the consumer, the client, they download an app, and for them, it's about convenience, connecting through this app to, well, call for a driver to take them wherever they need to be. But if I'm interested in becoming a driver, in technical terms, what am I? Am I an employee of these companies? Am I an independent contractor? Is there a contract that kind of regulates my relationship with this e-hailing facility?
No. So Uber considers drivers to be partners. That is how drivers are framed. So drivers will also download the app and they will, register as a driver, and they have to meet minimum requirements. But legally speaking, they are conceptualized and framed as independent contractors, like you've mentioned. So Uber does not necessarily hire drivers, and because there's no formal employment contract, as we know it to be, drivers are exploited and don't necessarily enjoy workers workers in a formal working environment.
Okay, I want to go to Batuka very quickly. Thank you so very much for joining us. So when these drivers then sign up, there's no formal contract, as we now know there isn't. How does the profit share work? Is it a percentage of profit that is taken? And how do they vary from company to company?
I lost you there for a second. Am I back?
Yes, what I'm wanting to understand is how the profit share works. When we look at the split of that fare for that particular ride, and since we now know that there aren't contractors, as it were, I'm just quite curious to understand how does the profit share works between the driver and the company.
All right, so let me first give you a bit of context, right? A primary issue we have is that we've got an defined relationship with companies, with vehicle providers as well. And this undefined relationship is where we find the room for exploitation and where the exploitation is happening. Now, on one end, Uber and Bolt then refer to drivers as partners, but there isn't a single decision-making platform that's reflective of a partnership. They take all the decisions independently, they determine the fares independently, which is becoming a problem because we are the skills providers and we are the asset providers. So the very problem in which we find ourselves in is that the way the revenue share is set up, we don't have a say in it. We are dictated to how it works. So Uber will take, let's call it 20 to 25%, and then that's further loaded on with other booking fees, card fees, and other transactional fees, and other hidden costs, which then cumulatively comes to closer to about 40%, between 35 and 40%, depending on the trip, depending on the area, depending on the demand, right? Uber takes theirs straight off the top, with no consideration for our operational costs, no consideration for increasing fuel costs, no consideration for insurance costs. So just the driver earnings, they take the lion's share and they take their cut first. And what then remains generally isn't enough for proper maintenance of the vehicle, for a driver or owner to then have a sustained, well-balanced life. In fact, the income that is earned by people in industry is considered below minimum wage by the Competition Commission in the research and the report findings released by the Commission.
Which puts them in direct conflict with South African legislation, as it were. And so I'm just wanting to understand then, given that particular profits share and the scenario involving that particular matter, what happens in an instance when a driver is, for instance, using an owner's vehicle? The vehicle doesn't belong to them, but they are invariably an Uber driver. Does that diminish the already below minimum wage takings that is generated from a trip?
So typically within the South African transportation sector, a vehicle owner is paid on a weekly basis, whatever agreed upon amount. Within e-hailing, it's typically between 2,000 and 2,500 rental fee for the vehicle. And then unless you are a driver owner, you see our financial system is very different. Whereby in other countries, it's easy for anybody to then access vehicle finance. In South Africa, you need to have some sort of credit worthiness to do so. So majority of the participants within the country, one, don't have credit worthiness. Two, majority of the e-hailing sector is serviced by undocumented migrant workers. So they don't have access to financial services. So then they are subjected to vehicle rental deals, which are very high. Most of these vehicle rental companies have some sort of interest. Uber has some direct interest in them. So, the vehicle rental is high, the income from Uber is low, which then makes it a very difficult working situation. And most guys just keep at it so that they are sort of somehow productive, but they're not generating enough money.
Sure. I want to go to Kobile before we just try and go to break. I want to understand the scenario involving then that profit share. When we say it's profitable as a business, profitable for whom exactly?
Definitely for Uber. So our findings and our research, a lot of Uber drivers had said that since joining Uber, their source of income has decreased, number one, and number two, like what Duke has said, a lot of the drivers on the platform don't own cars, right? And the drivers that do own cars took loans specifically to operate on Uber. And when you go back to the business model, Uber assumes that number one, drivers have own vehicles, number two, vehicles are owned by the drivers. That is to say, you don't own, the banks, etc. And because of that, you're able to make a profit. Now, in a case where you take out a loan specifically for Uber and you are barely making ends meet, we know then that is not a fair agreement. So Uber drivers have complained over the years that their income has definitely decreased because if you do own a car, you have to, pay back the loan. And if you don't own a car, there's more pressure pressure to work long working hours to make sure that you, number one, make a profit, and number two, you're able to pay the person that owns the car, that car rental every week.
Yeah. Okay, I want to go to a break very quickly, but once we return, then try to understand to what impact, a business like this would be profitable, because clearly they need the drivers, they need the vehicles, the liability is not there for companies like Uber and so on. But how then sustainable is e-hailing in this country and elsewhere? And I want to look at the Tanzanian model as well once we return. We have Kobile Chezi, the independent researcher, with us, as well as Watuka Mbelengwa, the national spokesperson for the e-hailing sector. And just joining us shortly after the break will be Monte Aldola, the director of the Innovative E-Hailing Forum. And that's it for this part of the discussion. Once we return, how profitable and sustainable is this industry? Thank you so very much for being with us. We are talking about e-hailing services in South Africa, looking at the global models as well. From what we've learned so far is that the sector largely is, well, reliant on the workers and their vehicles to do the service and to particularly deliver the service. But what are the liabilities here to the company, and how do we take this discussion further? I'd like to welcome at this stage Mr. Monte Aldola Makulu, the director of the Innovative E-Hailing Forum. Thank you so very much for joining us, sir. If we look at a scenario where the profit share is this low for the driver and potentially the owner of the vehicle with very little liability for the e-hailing company, Kobile, I've been wondering why companies like DiDi, Bolt, and some of the others would be able to effectively come with a more competitive price to the consumer. Taking into consideration, petrol has gone up. There are, wears and tears certainly to the vehicle, etc. The cost of living is going up. Does that mean that the profit share for the driver diminishes, Kobile?
Oh, absolutely. And it's just because that, right? So drivers complain that there are a lot of vehicles on the platform, meaning that there is, competition within e-hailing, right? So like you said, you have like petrol prices, which are very high. You have a lot of cars on the platform. You have inflation rates going up, etc. And again, like Fatuka said, these companies, Bolt, Uber, etc., they just take their commission, which ranges from 20 to 25% for Uber, 15 to 20% for Bolt, and they just really can't be bothered about ensuring that these vehicles are in good working condition and if these vehicles are serviced or not. So a lot of drivers incur all of these costs, right? With Uber just profiting regardless. And Fatuka will hopefully shed light more on what they're doing to ensure that Uber drivers are able to make a living from this form of work.
Okay, I want to go to Mr. Monte Aldola Makulu again. He is the director of Innovative and E-Hailing Forum. Are companies then like DiDi and Bolt, even though they appear to be competitive for you and I as the consumer, are they then slightly more exploitative? Given that the product is slightly cheaper, but the profit margin would then invariably be much lower, Mr. Monte Aldola? All right. Okay. So, Mr. Matuka, the scenario then with companies like DiDi and Bolt and so on that do make it a bit more competitive for the benefit of the consumer. I'm trying to then understand, given the low profit margin and disparity in where the profits lie, does that mean they're a bit more exploitative? How do they vary in terms of their service and offering compared to, for instance, Uber, which is slightly bigger and a bit more global?
Essentially, the service is the same. The problem is that there's no accountability held by the app companies. So it doesn't matter how many vehicles they put on the platform. For them, they're going to collect what they collect, which then shows an insensitivity towards the people participating or making vehicles available, because then there's market saturation. And then to remain competitive within themselves, they keep undercutting the pricing because they carry no operational expenses. Uber didn't take up prices up until we went on the national shutdown earlier this year. Over the past 5 to 6 years, there wasn't a single price increase. In fact, there were decreases, although fuel was consistently on the rise. So you've got a situation whereby a regulated framework with a proper price determining tool or instrument in place We'll ensure that everybody is protected. We'll ensure that the price that is put in place is fair. We'll ensure that new participants can also emerge within the space.
Yeah, and then I want to then understand that if there are new partners that could emerge in the space, as Vatuka says there, Mr. Monte Aldola, is there space for a service like this to be competitive while still underscoring the dignity and the rights of the worker, the driver? All right, Kobile, I want to put that to you. You know, given the fact that we sit within a space where, you know, it's pretty much unregulated, and again, the challenge here being put to the driver, notwithstanding the safety concerns, which we'll get into right now, I'm wondering how sustainable is an industry like this, because at the moment it appears to be pretty much exploitative, and as it stands, whether a competitive edge can come to the sector to the point where the workers' rights, the workers' dignity is accorded to them.
Yeah, I think the biggest problem is that, you know, drivers have expressed that they are voiceless, right? Drivers have expressed that they don't have any say in how the prices are determined. They don't have any say in, you know, like the number of cars operating on the platform, etc. Right? And so when you're talking about how can this industry be sustainable while ensuring that worker rights are also, you know, accessible to the workers or the drivers, then we need the platform to express their own concerns, right? And this means that the drivers themselves have to say, listen, obviously, you know, these fair prices, etc., are not they're not fair to us, especially people who are investing in our skills, people who are investing in our apps. And so how can we make sure that, you know, we're able to make sustainable living? And repeatedly, Uber would say, listen, again, we are not a transport service provider. We are just here to, you know, give you guys the platform, give you guys the app, and create employment opportunities, especially in, you know, the context such as Africa, where we have very high unemployment levels. And I know, you know, associations, drivers, etc., have been trying to talk to Uber, talk to Bolt, with no success, or with very little success, right? So the key here is to make sure that drivers have a voice and drivers are able to say, listen, if we are going to be defined as partners, if we are going to be defined as investors, etc., we need to be able to, you know, partake in these negotiations and make sure that we are able to center our own rights as people that want to also make a profit on the platform.
Yeah, Kobile, is this a unionized sector? Do the unions have any exposure in representing the workers, whether in South Africa or elsewhere, from the research that you've done?
So from the research that we have done, no, right? And we have also been trying to like engage with like, you know, unions in the transport sector to just ask, what have you guys been doing? How are you guys like helping, you know, drivers? But I do know that there are associations, and Fatuka is part of one association. And so drivers have formed associations such as, you know, the movement, such as the PPTA that Fatuka is part of. And so there are these associations, you know, that number one, try and interact with different stakeholders, such as the Minister of Transport, such as the Competition Commission, etc., to just say that, listen, in this interaction, in this labor setup, we don't have a vote.
Yeah.
And these are grievances, these are our concerns. We can make sure that we are able to make a profit and live.
And I want to get into understanding, you know, just that, you know, how do we particularly understand, you know, the sustainability of the sector moving forward to the point where we can find a worker's voice in this particular sector, or should the government be stepping in? We'll get into that and more after the break. It is the weekly Workers' World Labour Show. We are chatting about e-hailing, the famous Uber, DiDi, Bolt that we all use from time to time. It's expensive, as some of us may well feel, but if we look at and do a breakdown of the profit share, workers walk away with very little. We also established from the earlier parts of our program that they're also not represented, and when they do raise their voices, they are not heard. So how can we bring some sort of structure to this particular sector with the intention to protect the worker? That and more will form part of our discussion moving forward. I'd like to, you know, Mr. Vatuka Belengwa, try and understand, you know, the enthusiasm that we saw with the sector. You know, when it started, a lot of drivers started to sign up because they thought there was going to be an opportunity here for jobs and maybe a good, decent money that they could earn. And they essentially their own boss, they work on their own time. But soon with that became a challenge, a security and a safety challenge. You had other sectors within the transport or other drivers within the transport sector essentially targeting e-hailing services. And then of course, when an e-hailing service were to move into certain parts of Cape Town, they get accosted, attacked, and sometimes even hijacked. Talk to me about the working conditions of a typical e-hailing driver.
Well, yes, certainly when people were drawn in, there wasn't enthusiasm because South Africa is an opportunity-scarce country. And, you know, when we were told that come in, you can make up to 8,000 Rand a week, people were happy to then make themselves available to participate in such work. But this, we later learned, it was a complete lie. Yes, in terms of the safety issue, one, it begins with vetting, right? We're advocating for is that we need vetting of drivers, thorough vetting, and it should be done by an independent oversight body, not the app companies independently. Two, vetting should then also be done on riders because riders can just access the platform with a SIM card and some data, but this then gives criminals access to the platform as well. This is why there's such a high prevalence of crime within the space, which makes it a very uncomfortable working conditions because drivers have to be online extra long hours to try and meet their targets, which they often don't. And as a result, they're exposed to higher levels of crime. You know, cell phones being snatched, dangerous assaults, hijackings are very common within the space. And the technology can be built to be safe. It's intentionally built not to be safe because should you then put in proper safety protocols like vetting, that would mean the app companies are being held accountable. And what we're learning from organizations like Uber and Bolt, which are global anarchists, that they've got no ambition to be held accountable. And this is what we are trying to then also then come about and address as associations emerging in the space.
Yeah.
Firstly, we're on a journey to understand.
On the flip side of that, I want to put to you as well that there are very real concerns that come from the riders, safety concerns that they may well have. We've heard about companies that would traditionally refer to ride with one or two particular companies, and they either get robbed or even sexual abuse that happens, you know, to them. They become a victim of it when traveling, you know, particularly with the service. What sort of screening and control does the company have over the driver and the security when the commute is busy happening?
Yes, this is why I said vetting should be done by an oversight independent party instead of the app company, because as you may be aware that you've got majority undocumented migrant workers. They will come in fake passports, fake licenses, and then Uber and Bolt accept them without verifying these documents. So when a sexual assault happens and then you go to the country that issued that license doesn't exist even within that country. And therefore that person can't be traced, right? But for Uber, their intention and why they primarily target undocumented migrant workers is because they're the most vulnerable in society and they are looking to exploit and make profit off of cheap labor. So if we're then doing an independent vetting process, like for example, telecoms, radio, you've got ICASA. That's the oversight body that makes sure that there's compliance within the space. We need the same sort of thing for the e-hailing space.
Okay, within
make sure that participants are properly, or companies participating, compliant and adhering to certain frameworks that we agreed upon.
Yeah, but we have the argument for some sort of regulation to ensure the safety of commuters and drivers. Kobile, I want to pick up very quickly on the other models that exist. In your research particularly looked at the Dar es Salaam model as well. How different in essence do they operate compared to the South African market?
There really wasn't much difference, if you're being very honest. So again, there's like Uber and Bolt in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, and they essentially operate the same way. So there wasn't really difference. In our research, what we basically were interested in finding was whether the drivers were able to make a profit in the e-hailing industry across these three cities, and the findings are there. And I can tell you right now, yeah, the findings or the stats are really bad. Drivers are being exploited in the African continent in general.
And compared to further overseas, let's look at parts of Europe, the United States, how do they compare?
I mean, there have been like documentaries on Uber drivers, specifically in the US, Uber drivers that are homeless, that live in their cars, that can't afford, to pay off their loans, etc. So I just think globally, the condition of an Uber driver is the same. Uber drivers are exploited, period, regardless of where you are.
Yeah, I want to try and maybe put this then to Mr. Monte Aldola Makulu, the Director of Innovative E-Hailing Forum. Is there a space to reform e-hailing from what we've heard? Is there a market for anybody to open up an e-hailing service, come up with a technology and try and bring reform to the sector? How practical is that?
Well, at the moment, it's not practical. Thank you for having me. My network has been giving me problems. And you know what, I think Nqobile have had a mouthful in terms of how e-hailing is operation internationally. I mean, it's a gig economy. We expect that the industry generates enough money, to produce entrepreneurs or business model that will benefit everyone that is involved. I would say, to directly answer your question, there is a huge space of growth, and there's look. The problem is that it's an exploitation, but e-hailing or gig economy, it's a good initiative. It's a good economy, and it came at the right time. It's just that it's operational. It's not favorable to the people that operate it.
But
so,
does a scenario, Mr. Aldola, does a scenario exist that if I wish to start a company today, the proprietary information is there for me to look into, and can I come with a business model that may well be a bit more expensive to the consumer, but essentially be guided by, let's say, government legislation on how the sector ought to be designed?
Yes, you must remember, anything that is guided by the government, it means there's a regulation involved. And if there's a regulation involved, and that would mean, change of everything that is happening right now. So we don't have that regulation at the moment. Once we have it, we can now have a confidence to say it will work for both parties, because you can't just increase prices for the consumer, because the consumer would not use the service. At the same time, you can't decrease it to effect that you don't make profit. So a regulation, in fact, if it comes in place, it will talk to all parties that are involved in the game.
Okay, I want to put to you, Vatuka, what does regulation look like in its essence? Very quickly, how do you want to see the industry protected?
For me, essentially, we've got an oversight body.
Yeah.
We've got an oversight body like ICASA, and as an app company, there must be some sort of compliance conditions. How are you going to take care of your drivers? What sort of relationship you're going to have with your drivers? How are you going to then manage the sort of influx of vehicles onto your platform? But then again, that should be a government-controlled aspect whereby permits are issued based on the demand. If you look at historically meter taxis, the municipality or the PREs, provincial regulating authorities, would based on an economic study avail more permits based on demand. Something like that should then work, and that should be then coupled with an empowerment model for the local participants to grow as well, for the current participants to grow. We ensure we ensure local participation. Right, government is putting 15 billion rand into new initiatives for local initiatives, but if we're not going to ensure that new initiatives can't emerge and are being suppressed by like the Ubers and Bolts who are underpricing and undercutting everybody and making it difficult for other app companies to emerge, then it's a fruitless investment. So a regulated framework should do that, and we should make sure at least 80% of participants are local, from whether you're an app driver, any part of the value chain should be at least 80% localized.
Yeah, Kobile, I think there's very little much to disagree with there. So maybe just your concluding remarks. How does one bring protection to this industry, and how practical is that? Very quickly.
Sorry, please repeat, Tash. I didn't quite get the question.
Okay, I was just quickly trying to understand that. Of course, there is a requirement for regulation here, but how practical is that? How do you see this happen? Do you think it's purely for government to step in?
I think it's needed, right? So there is a need for a regulatory board. That government, the Minister of Transport has to, be forthcoming, and there has to be, like Fatuka said, local participation, right? You can't depend on the services and the assets of Uber drivers and then deprive them of having a voice. It makes no sense, right? Without the drivers, there is no Uber, there is no Bolt, and there is no DiDi, etc. So these are the people that have the assets. These are the people that have the skills, and they need to obviously have more voice. It only makes sense. So I agree with what Fatuka said, rather. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Aldola, I'm going to have to thank you for joining us, but just very quickly before I go, I'm just pushed for a couple of seconds. Do you think that the industry is sustainable? Would we look at an industry like this in the next 5 to 10 years?
Pardon me, I didn't get that test, please.
Okay, do you think the industry is sustainable for the next couple of years?
Oh, yes, definitely. There's a lot that we're looking for, as long as everything is legally and regulated, and it speaks to the local benefits. We're looking forward to a new phase of e-hailing if the government is doing what it's supposed to do.
All right. Thank you so very much for having joined us. And I think that is the discussion that we're in right now. So thank you for being with us and starting this conversation. Hopefully that we can build on it. And so I think this is where we are right now. Innovation is great. Technology is great. But unless it is protective of the people that drive it, we're not going to get anywhere. And so hopefully a discussion like this will not just be a particular push for government, but also for unions and the working class to begin to organize and ensure that there's protection for the worker, the driver, and everybody else in the value chain. Thank you so very much for having joined us. This was the Workers' World Media Labour Show.